Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're very excited to have with us tonight Mr. Elliot Ackerman. He's served 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's a decorated veteran, having earned the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Purple Heart. He's a former White House Fellow whose writings have been published by The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New Republic, and many more. He has also appeared on Charlie Rose, The Colbert Report, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, Al Jazeera, and PBS, amongst many others. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Elliot Ackerman.
Thank you, Semper Fi, to you too. Thanks so much to the Houston World Affairs Council for having me. Thought what I'd do is read a little bit from my novel Green on Blue and discuss that work, and then we can also maybe have a more wide-ranging discussion as well about Afghanistan. So this is from the beginning. Many would call me a dishonest man, but I've always kept faith with myself. There is an honesty in that, I think. I am Ali's brother. We are from a village that no longer exists, and our family was not large or prosperous. The war that came after the Russians, but before the Americans, killed our parents. Of them, I have only dim memories. There is my father's Kalashnikov hidden in a woodpile by the door. Him cleaning it, working oiled rags on its parts, and the smell of gunmetal and feeling safe. There is my mother's secret, the one she shared with me. Once a month, she'd count out my father's earnings from fighting in the mountains or farming. She'd send me and Ali from our village, Sperkai, to the large bazaar in Orgun, a 2-day walk. The Orgun bazaar sold everything: fine cooking oils and spices, candles to light our home, and fabrics to repair our clothes. My mother always entrusted me with a special purchase. Before we left, she would press an extra coin in my hand, one she'd stolen from my father. Among the crowded stalls of the bazaar, I would slip away from my brother's watchful eye and buy her a pack of cigarettes, a vice forbidden to a woman. When we returned home, I would place the pack in her hiding spot, the birchwood cradle where she'd rocked Ali and me as infants. Our mud-walled house was small, 2 thatch-roofed rooms with a courtyard between them. The cradle was kept in the room I shared with Ali. My mother would never get rid of the cradle. It was the one thing that was truly hers. At night, after we'd returned from the bazaar, she'd sneak into our room, her small, sandaled feet gliding across the carpets that lined the dirt floor. Her hand would cup a candle, its smothered light casting shadows on her young face, aging her. Her eyes, one brown and the other green, a miracle or defect of birth, shifted about the room. Carefully, she would lean over the cradle as she'd done before taking us to nurse. She would run her fingers between the blankets that once swaddled my brother and me, and, finding the pack I'd left her, she'd step into the courtyard, and I'd fall back asleep to the faint smell of her tobacco just past my door. This secret made me feel close to my mother. In the years since, I've wondered why she entrusted me with it. At times, I've thought it was because I was her favorite. But this isn't why. The truth is, she recognized in me her own ability to deceive. So that's the opening, and the voice you're hearing is that of the novel's protagonist, a young Afghan named Aziz, who eventually goes off to fight with a militia in a remote part of southeastern Afghanistan by the border with Pakistan. So the title of the novel, Green on Blue, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, it refers to the ubiquitous insider attacks we often see in the news in Afghanistan, where an Afghan soldier will basically turn his weapon on his American advisor and kill him. So green is basically military short speak for friendly forces, and blue for our own. But in the book, the idea of this green on blue attack, it really becomes a metaphor. You know, what happens when the cause that you're fighting for threatens to destroy you? So I served in Afghanistan between 2008 and 2011. in various provinces around the country in the east, south, and the west. And during that time, I worked exclusively as an advisor to Afghan troops. And we did all the things that soldiers have always done. You know, we fought alongside one another, we bled together, and we mourned friends together. But when it came time for me to go home, you know, these Afghan soldiers had become basically my war buddies. And they weren't coming back to the U.S. with me. So as much as I, you know, would have liked to have friended them on Facebook, called long distance to check up and see how they were doing, you know, or even go get quarter beers with them at the local VFW, that wasn't an option. So for me, writing this book, Green on Blue, which is all told in the voice of an Afghan soldier, in many respects, it was a way to reckon with the loss of those relationships and really to try to lend them voice in a last act of friendship and to try to tell the story of the war as I thought they saw it as their friend. So it's oftentimes very difficult, you know, when you're writing a novel to know, you know, where the story really begins. I mean, so much of the work is groping in the dark to sort of even understand the narrative that you're trying to provide. You know, the beginning of the book frequently becomes the middle becomes the end, and often your end becomes your beginning, and you're constantly sort of struggling to understand, you know, what it is the characters in the book are trying to tell you and what's the story that's trying to be revealed. But throughout the writing of this novel, you know, there was an anecdote that I felt was always sort of right to the side of me, something I kept looking at, and it was an experience I'd had when I was an advisor in 2009 in a remote and very difficult part of Afghanistan in the southeast. So during that time, I was the advisor to a fellow named Isak, Commander Isak, and he'd been fighting in Afghanistan's Paktika province for about 10 years. And we lived together on a fire base that was about the size of 3 football fields in the high desert. And about every 2 weeks, we would have what was very grandiosely termed our operational planning meeting. What it basically involved was what I would go from the plywood hut, which was sort of my hooch where I lived, and I would sort of walk across our dusty fire base to Isak's plywood hut where he lived. And I'd open up his swinging door, and I would flop down on this little sofa he had, sort of a lumpy love seat. And you know, he would sit down next to me, and sitting on this lumpy sofa, there's a little plywood table in front of us, and he would get down a pot of chai, some tea for us, and he'd put out a pack of smokes. And we would sit there on the sofa, and we would stare across his room, and on the far wall were 2 things, a large map and a calendar. And we'd sit there, and I'd say, well, you know, Isak, it's you got about the next 2 weeks to plan. You know, where do you think we should head? You know, what do you think we should go do? And Isak knew the ground better than anyone. As I mentioned, he'd been there for almost a decade fighting. Was the leader of this militia group that I was working with. And so he would, you know, smoking on his cigarette, come up to the map. He would stroke his face, and he would point to one of the villages right on the border. And point to one and say, you know, Mr. Elliot, we could go up to Mangrate. You know, there's always very good hunting up in Mangrate. So I'd say, all right, Isak, yeah, we'll run a patrol up to Mangrate. So we'd mark out 6 or 7 days on the calendar. We'd go out back. We'd tell the troops about it. We'd get them in their trucks. You know, about 120, 130 of us would roll out in 15 some vehicles. We would drive up to Mangrate, which was a tough part of the country. You know, 50-50 odds. We'd get into some type of gunfight while we were there, and then we would drive back down to our fire base, do whatever maintenance we had to do on our vehicles, give the soldiers a day off. You know, and inevitably, 2 weeks would have passed, and I would be walking from my hut across the fire base again to Isak's hut for our operational planning meeting. I would flop down on the lumpy sofa. You know, same thing, pot of chai, pack of smokes, Isak and I staring at the map and the calendar. And I would say, all right, Isak, you know, it's a great operation we just ran in Mangrate. You know, where do you think we should head next? And he would come up smoking his cigarette, stroking his chin, and say, you know, Mr. Elliot. And he'd point to the next village south. We could go to Rarakare. There's always very good hunting in Rarakare. So I'd say, all right, Isak, we'll go to Rarakare. And we would do the same thing. You know, but the conversation between us was never, you know, Mr. Elliot, if we go to Mangrate, then we hit them in Rarakare. We can go do one last operation to the south in Malakshey. We'll shut the border down. The war will be over. You know, I can go back to my fields, and you know, you can go get your Master of Fine Arts. I don't know, write that novel you're always talking about. That wasn't the conversation. You know, it wasn't a war, I think, as we often think of it as Americans. You know, one with a beginning, with definite objectives, with even a grand strategy and an end. So if it wasn't that type of war, you know, what type of war was it? And, you know, in the story that's told in Green on Blue, very much, you know, the ambition of that book is to try to render that type of war through story, to try to show a paradigm that was one I saw time and time again in valley after valley, district after district, province after province in Afghanistan. You know, what was the type of war we were fighting? So I'd like to read another small portion of the book to you all, which gets into that a little bit. So as I mentioned, you know, the novel is all told from the perspective of Aziz, this young Afghan who goes off to fight. And as the book opens, his parents are killed, and it's in the period between the fighting with the Soviets and before the American invasion, so really during the rise of the Taliban. And after his parents are killed, his brother takes him to a city called Orgun, where the two of them eke out a living basically working as delivery boys in a marketplace, until his brother is horrifically wounded in a bombing and finds himself hospitalized. And to keep his brother in the hospital and to pay for his treatment, Aziz is recruited into a militia. And the deal being that he'll fight for those things. And so he basically gets sucked into this war that becomes increasingly elliptical, and he realizes is being fought in many respects for every reason but the ending of the war. And the commander of this unit has ambitions to build an outpost in a village called Gomal. And to further those ends, he asks Aziz to be an informant in that village. And when Aziz goes to become an informant, he starts living with an old Mujahideen fighter who had fought the Soviets, a man named Mumtaz. And so these are Mumtaz's words, him talking about the war and his experience in it against the Soviets. When my brother died, he said, it was not in the war we thought we fought. We were Mujahideen and treated as heroes in this village, our battlefield achievements known by all, earning us honor we became greedy for. This led to larger and more daring attacks. When the fighting slowed each winter, we'd grow impatient for it. The Russians stayed on their bases, and it was difficult to strike at them. An informant of ours in Orgun, a man who, like our father, ran a trucking company, told us how in a few nights a Russian convoy would pass our village along the North Road. Eager as we were, my brother and I asked few questions. The operation would be simple. After curfew, we'd bury a mine in the road, and in the morning, if the Russians didn't show up, we'd remove it. Some days later, in the darkness, my brother and I chipped a ditch out of the frozen earth and slid the mine in. We carefully repacked the crumbled soil and went home, giving the matter little thought, as if we'd planted a tree and casually wondered if it'd grow. We slept soundly, and early the following morning, before the sun rose, we returned to either inspect our kill or to recover the mine. As we walked through the clear, cold air, the snow on the distant hilltops glowed with firelight. The mine had struck, and we approached the road riding on great gusts of enthusiasm. But still, our situation was uncertain. Who knew if the Russians had sent anyone to aid their convoy? Who knew if we'd come across any manic survivors? These were uncertainties we felt prepared for. We weren't prepared for what we found. As we crested a last ridge and glimpsed our kill, we saw only the beginning of our terrible mistake. Tilted against its side, as if the carcass of a great steel beast was the truck. But it wasn't Russian. It was civilian and full of lumber that now burned in a pyre, sparkling on the snow. We kept our distance, but were close enough to feel the fire on our faces. We could see the cab and its white paint, which curled to scales against the heat, and then the steel beneath the paint that scorched to rust. Behind a shattered windshield, flames licked out an upright silhouette that burned with the dignity of one who met death immediately, without pain and shock, and through this absence seemed strangely alive. I can't say how long we watched the pyre. When we left, the sun still hadn't risen, but the silhouette had been consumed. On our journey home, we said nothing and tried to hide in our silence. News of the attack spread through all the families of Gomal. The truck had been from our informant's company, and the dead driver had been his employee. Several days later, my father and our village's Spengaris were called to a yurga in Orgun to settle the matter. The deliberations were short, lasting but 2 days, and my father returned in ruin. The Spengaris on both sides decreed that our father was responsible for our actions, and that he must replace the destroyed truck and buy yet another to recoup the damaged cargo. And this our informant made out very well. For the first truck forced us to sell our home, and the second wiped out my father's accounts, eliminating him as a business competitor. And that's when we moved here. So this is Mumtaz's story. You know, and Mumtaz is, again, as I mentioned, an old Mujahideen fighter who was fighting, at least in Afghan eyes, what is very much the good war against the Soviets. You know, but even in that war, we can see that the conflict has certain economies in it. And when I say economies, I don't necessarily mean strictly financial economies, although oftentimes that's parts of it. But economies in terms of how people are incented. You know, everywhere around Afghanistan, when you look at the war, it's so embedded in the culture that in many respects, like my friend Commander Isak, the war had elevated him. You know, he was somebody who commanded a militia of over 200 troops, the vast majority of which were members of his family and at least his extended tribe. So without the war, he really had no context. All of his power, all of his societal positioning was wrapped up in his job as the commander of this militia. So when we have a war that elevates people like that, in many ways, they're no longer incented to end the war. You know, and how does that play out in the long term? And in the case of Mumtaz, you know, Mumtaz's case in this lumber dispute, it's actually very similar to one of the most wide-ranging and difficult battlefields in the Afghan war, which was in Kunar province, the Korangal Valley, which was made famous by the film Restrepo. And if you know anything about the Korangal Valley, which is called, as many valleys were, but this one was called the Valley of Death, the inception of that conflict had nothing to do with the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. It basically had to do with a lumber dispute between two very senior village elders, and we as the Americans early on after the invasion were basically ployed into supporting one of these elders against another, and that led to a blood feud which really pitted that valley against the Americans on one side and the Taliban on the other. Again, these incentives and economies of war are very real. One of my jobs when I was in Afghanistan is I worked in intelligence, particularly in my last 2 years there, and so I spent a lot of time debriefing Afghans who would come into our various fire bases with information. And there was always a cadence to those conversations. First of all, it seemed the Afghans would come always at the most inconvenient times. So I could almost conjure an Afghan out of thin air if I wanted to, you know, sit down and make myself a tall pancake breakfast. An Afghan would appear at the front gate. Or if I was taking a shower, an Afghan would appear at the front gate. But inconveniences aside, the dynamic was always one of an Afghan sitting across a desk from me, assuring me that he had information that was very important for me and for my government. And me trying to tease out what that information was from the Afghan, who was my interlocutor, but also trying to understand really what his motivations were. Because unless I was naive, most of the people walking into our firebase with information, the reason they were coming was not as simple as they wanted to see a free and democratic Afghanistan. There was always something in it for them. And actually, you know, the novel, which is told, again, is told in the first person from the perspective of Aziz, the soldier. When I was first thinking up this book and sort of writing it, the rhythm of the book and the frame of the book was actually one of these conversations, where there's a character in the novel who doesn't exist now. So the opening I read to you is Aziz's voice coming straight to you as the reader, but the original opening actually has an American intelligence officer talking about this Afghan who walks in, and the Afghan, Aziz, is telling him his story. So the frame is very much sort of like this Conradian structure, like The Heart of Darkness, if you're familiar with that work, where Marlowe is telling his story on a boat in the Thames about going upriver in the Congo to see Kurtz. But in the writing of the novel, that frame was never really holding up. You know, and I had to start asking myself, you know, why is it that I had built in this American character for Aziz to tell his story to? And why wasn't that American character working? And furthermore, you know, what was the motivation of even writing this novel in the first place? Which kind of came back to what I spoke to you all before. It was, when I was honest with myself, I wanted to try to tell a side of the war and tell the story about a side of the war that wasn't being told as often, which was how it looked through the eyes of Afghans. And that caused me eventually to rip out this entire structure of having an American be the frame through which we hear Aziz's story. And now he speaks directly to the reader, but that was something very frightening for me to do, because if you haven't noticed, I'm not Afghan. So, but you know, at the end of the day, like all novels, it was a work of imagination, and I had to hold true to that. You know, and on that note, you know, one of the things that strikes me, a lot of times people ask me, you know, why write a novel? And aside from, you know, my diligent belief in fiction, the fact that I'm the son of a novelist, that I studied literature, I think it's a fair question. You know, what makes a novel relevant today, particularly when the immediacies and, you know, the facts that we're presented with every day, whether it be Afghanistan, ISIS, Yemen, seem so pressing, and it seems so difficult to get your head around at any given moment who we're being told are the critical threats to us at home. So why a story? Well, I believe that people remember stories, and that stories have power, and that the point of a story is to elicit in the reader an emotional response similar to the one you had when putting the words on the page, and that transference is important. But furthermore, as I thought about that, you know, when I was in Afghanistan right now, actually, it's a country that's been at war for 36 years, since 1979 when the Soviets invaded. The life expectancy in Afghanistan is 60.5 years old. So if you do the math, the people who are dying in Afghanistan right now, dying off, were in their early 20s when the Soviets invaded. So if you go out another 10 years, assuming that the conflict there will still be going on in some fashion for 5 or 10 years, that means that the people who will have been alive when the Soviets invaded would have been 10, 11, 12 years old. You in 5 to 10 years might have nobody in Afghanistan who can even remember what Afghanistan was like when it was at peace. And so when you have nobody in a country who can remember what that country was like at peace, the idea of attaining peace becomes a sheer act of imagination, much the same as writing a novel. But as an American, to be fair, I think I reflect back on what that means for us as a country. We've now been at war for going on 15 years. And could we, in 10 or 15 more years, be looking back in much the same way and have few people who can remember what this country was like when it was at peace? And how much is peace at any time a sheer act of imagination? So with that thought, I'd like to just read one last section, and then maybe we can open up for some questions and conversation. This is a brief segment, which is the character Aziz's reflections when he goes to visit Mumtaz, the old Mujahideen fighter I met before, and he goes to Gomal, this village where they're trying to build an outpost, and he's looking around Gomal, reflecting on how poor it is. The night was cold, and all through it I got up, stepped lightly over Mumtaz, and fed dried branches into the mouth of the stove. Once the last scrap burned out in the fire, a chill set into my legs and woke me. I walked into the compound's dirt courtyard to wait for the dawn. As the early light came, I saw how poor Mumtaz was. His home was nothing more than the small coop, the mud room we slept in, and the 4 walls of the courtyard. A ditch ran beneath one of the walls and out the back. Dishes were stacked alongside it. This was the kitchen. Past Mumtaz's compound were the mountains. Though it seemed these never ended, they were not enough to protect the village from the war, but they were enough to preserve it and its traditions. And, even as isolated as the village was, sprouts of progress had arrived. Motorbikes, cell phones, and a few homemade satellite dishes that perched from rooftops, all standing as messengers from other, more modern worlds. But it was a false progress. It measured not movement forward, but the distance we would soon travel backward when the war destroyed everything. Thank you.
So while staff is collecting some question cards, I'm going to start off with a slightly lengthy question, which I'm sure is in everybody's mind. From a country that has been at war with Afghanistan for 15 years, what does the potential for the possible final drawdown, which has been shifted, I hear, the deadline, what does it mean for us, and what does it mean for the Afghans?
Right. Well, first of all, I try not to think of it as though we've been at war with Afghanistan, because I think there's a civil war going on in Afghanistan, because I think, you know, there are a lot of Afghans who, you know, who have been supportive of the U.S. aims there. But strangely, you know, I think what's going on right now, and we had President Ashraf Ghani visiting last week to the U.S. and President Obama's announcement of continuation of the U.S. troop presence of 10,000 so troops, at least to the end of the year. And you know, I think as we look at what's happened in the world, particularly over the last year, you know, I would say in some respects, and I hope you don't think I'm being glib, but the best thing to happen to Afghanistan is ISIS. And what I mean by that is, if you look at what happened in Iraq post-2012 after a precipitous U.S. troop withdrawal, that and the emergence of ISIS in that region, I think that's probably given officials in the administration has called them a certain degree of pause, and that as a direct result of that, we're seeing a much more slow and considerate withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. So I think that the example of the collapse in Iraq is directly informing this current decision to keep troops in Afghanistan for a longer amount of time. That being said, I don't necessarily think it's the troop numbers that are as important as it is really a signal that the United States is going to continue to be engaged in the region. And I think if we look at the example of Iraq, the challenge you had there was less that had there been 5,000 troops or 10,000 troops, had we signed a status of forces agreement, I think it's less an issue that those 5,000 or 10,000 troops would have held some sort of Maginot line against ISIS. It's more, it would have been a very clear signal to the Sunni sheikhs, who are the ones who supported the U.S. during the Sunni awakening at the end of the Iraq War, that the U.S. was still very much engaged in the region. And when we left, those very same Sunni sheikhs really no longer had an ally in the region. And that's why they cut the deals that they cut with ISIS, and we saw ISIS sweep into cities like Fallujah, Ramadi, and Mosul. So, but I'm a little bit more bullish on the future of Afghanistan than the future of Iraq.
There's a couple of questions about, in comparison with the Soviets and how the Afghans saw the Soviets versus how do they see us, the Americans?
Sure. Well, you know, as I mentioned in my remarks, the war against the Soviets is very much, you know, it's the Afghan Iliad. I mean, it's their Second World War. It's the good war. You can't meet a 55, 60-year-old Afghan Spengari elder without him wanting to tell you, if he had any part in fighting the Soviets, all about what he did to the Soviets. So you know, 1 million Afghans were killed during the Soviet occupation. I mean, far, far more. It was a much bloodier time than the current wars with the Taliban and even the time after the Soviets left. I think that the Afghans viewed the Soviets as far more brutal, you know, but at the same time, the Soviets were socially, you know, we can't forget this, they were extremely liberal when it came to Afghanistan, particularly with regards to rights, you know, rights for women, which is, you know, continues to be a significant issue there. I think one of the telling things about the Soviets versus the Americans is, if you walk around the majority of the main American bases in Afghanistan, like Kandahar Airfield or Bagram, and you look at the structures where many of these units have their, you know, their command and control centers from, you know, major headquarters. The command and control centers are all built out of plywood. And if you go to some of the old, I was stationed at an old Soviet base. It was an airfield near the Iranian border. And there was an Olympic-sized swimming pool the Soviets had built. There were barracks made out of, I mean, thick reinforced concrete. And it was, in some respects, just a very interesting, if you look at just the architecture, it sort of shows the mentality of the two nations. When the Soviets showed up, they showed up to stay. Like, they had no plans of leaving. They were building structures to last. And as Americans, having occupied much longer than the Soviets now, everything, not everything, but the vast majority of things, it's still made out of plywood. It's still as though we're sort of, we're expecting at any moment that we're going to go home. So I think that's a significant difference, just the mindset of the Soviet occupation versus the American occupation. I think we have, as soon as we got in, it was sort of, we were looking for the doors to get out, and not inappropriately so. But ironically, as eager as we were to head for the exits, we've yet to find one.
A couple of questions going back to your book. One of them, what age do the characters in your book start off at? Aziz, what age is he, and how far along are you going in his life?
Sure. So I mentioned the novel opens with Aziz as a young boy. And there, when writing this book, I think any work of fiction, you build constraints into the narrative depending on how you're writing it, whether you're writing it from an omniscient third-person narrator where you don't have that many constraints, to a book like Green on Blue where you're writing from the first person and you're writing from the perspective of an Afghan. So to be true to that, I can only have Aziz talking about things and perceiving things that it seems honest that Aziz would perceive. And one of the things that's a little murky is Aziz's age in the book. Because frankly, if you ask most Afghans how old they are, they don't really know. It's just a fact. I mean, they don't chart birthdays or things like that. It's not something culturally that has the same significance it does in our culture. But that being said, to just answer clearly, he's about 10 years old when you meet him, and the book follows him for about 9 years. So he's in his late teens, early 20s when the book wraps up, in my imagination.
In your imagination.
Yeah.
Also, another question about the part that you read. Was it unusual to have Afghans direct the flow of the fighting? You talked a little bit about he would say, this is where we're going, and you guys would plan accordingly. Was that unusual for you, or was that expected?
Sure. So, having being an advisor to Afghan units is it's a really interesting job. I loved it. I worked with a lot of service members who maybe didn't love it as much, and it's really a personality-based thing. You as this American, you have to gain a certain level of rapport with your Afghan counterpart, and this will oftentimes be someone who, like Isak, the gentleman I mentioned, who'd been working there for a decade. So if I think I'm going to walk in, and I would be on rotation, deploying in and out of a place. So I was, after a decade fighting in this one part of Afghanistan, I must have been probably the 20th advisor Isak had worked with. So if I think I'm going to walk in there sort of all bravado and tell Isak how to run the war in his part of the country, I've got another thing coming to me. But at the same time, you are in charge and you're responsible for what's going on there. And so how do you balance that? And if you'd entertain me a couple of anecdotes, there was one fella I worked with out in Western Afghanistan. He was a colonel, and he led a battalion of Afghan commandos. There's about 700 Afghan commandos, and they were responsible for doing raids against Taliban leadership out west. So his name was, no joke, he was about 6'3", pretty tall for an Afghan, and his name was Karim Abdul-Jabbar. So I remember when I met him, I knew I was going to be meeting Colonel Jabbar, and we were going to be working together for the next 7 months. And I was learning Dari. My Dari was kind of getting better, so I very much wanted to introduce myself in Dari to him, so I'd rehearsed it. So when I went up to him, I said, Isme man Toran Kahraman az didan shama khosh hodam, which means, my name, Isme man Toran, Captain Ackerman, az didan shama, from seeing you, khosh hodam, brings me great joy. So I'd rehearsed it, go to him, Commandant said Jabbar Isme man Toran Kahraman az didan shama khosh hodam, and he looks at me and goes, Toran Kahraman? I go, the Toran Ackerman. It's like, Toran Kahraman. I'm like, I look at my interpreter, my interpreter's laughing. I'm like, what's so funny? He's like, Toran Kahraman. I was like, what was Kahraman? He's like, Kahraman is like hero, brave guy. You are Captain Brave Guy. I'm like, yes, Isme man Toran Kahraman. So I spent 7 months in Afghanistan as Captain Brave Guy. So, which again, getting to this rapport was a nice way to build rapport with him. But at the same time too, those relationships you build out community, they can, I think, if you are good at your job, become intimate. Because you know what, people are people. That was about the extent of my, legendary Dari. So there are very real cultural barriers between us. But if you could seek past those cultural barriers and find ways to get around them, you would see these are people you're dealing with, and they have all the same concerns. So again, I remember at one point with Colonel Jabbar, we had to fly his battalion across the country. So we're trying to fly on Afghan air, 700 commandos from right outside Kabul to a city in southwestern Afghanistan. And as we were doing this, to sort of get ready for this massive movement of men and materiel, Colonel Jabbar and I were traveling around the country to a few critical waypoints, and it was just the two of us, and it was about a 10-day trip. And at that time, a lot of people in the U.S. military weren't used to seeing sort of an Afghan colonel flying on U.S. military air, so I was sort of his escort. And it also led to a lot of these sort of long, because we would get our interpreters wherever we went, these sort of long layovers at air bases. So you can imagine sort of these 4-hour awkward silence with me and this Afghan colonel who I've known for 3 weeks, trying to find small talk or something to do. And it took us about a day. What we figured out we would do is, it's obvious, we would play chess. We found the chessboard, and the two of us would play chess against one another. And 95% of the time, Colonel Jabbar would beat me. And every time, inevitably, he would sit there and he would, rook to bishop 2 or whatever it was. He'd checkmate me, and he'd look at me, he'd take his rook, knock over my king, and go, ha, ha, ha. My advisor. So again, I think the question was, did you let the Afghans plan most of it? I think you had to show a lot of respect to them, and you had to figure out how you were going to build bonds, whether it be chess or a joke about your name. Those things go a long way. You need to show you were trying.
Along the lines of your experience in combat and being involved in war, what were your perspectives of the world before this experience, and how has it changed since?
Geez, that's a really easy question. There's too many to mention. I think, one theme that I get into in my writing a bit is, if I were to sit here and you were to ask me, kind of the war, the combat experience, you were to ask me, like, hey, Elliot, think about the 10 best days of your life. Think about the 10 best days of my life. I would say about this many were days that I was in combat. And if you were to say to me, all right, Elliot, think about the 10 worst days of your life. I would say this many were days that I was in combat, and they were the exact same days. And sort of what does that say about me? What does that say about that experience? And I think that amongst the current group of veterans, each of our nation's wars has been a little bit different, from the national mobilization of the Second World War to the wide-scale draft in the Vietnam War, to these wars which have been fought with an all-volunteer military and largely financed through deficit spending. So we don't feel them in our taxes at home. And I think when we reflect back on these wars, you can't deny the fact, and I think in a lot of the the literature that's coming out of this, that everybody was a volunteer. By and large, aside from probably a segment of the National Guard for about 3 years that kind of kept getting roped in, or a few people who were called up in the IRR, not a few, but there were a few years where there was sort of some fluctuation there. But I would say, especially now, if you're joining the U.S. military in the last 6 or 7 years, you're going to war. And many people volunteer to go back several times and to keep going back. And why is it that they keep going back? What drives them there? And I think that's something that's getting explored in a lot of the literature that's coming out of these wars. And I think there's something uniquely, poignant and conflicted and sometimes sad to know that, this is something that is difficult, but we all chose it and we keep choosing it. And why is that? So that's something that the war taught me.
The character in your book obviously was drawn into this war. How does the war affect everybody's life in Afghanistan? Or are there people that have been able to or have stayed separate from the war?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the war affects everyone in Afghanistan, although in different measures, and the war is different everywhere in Afghanistan. I think, in 2009, when there was this surge in Afghanistan, there was this sort of idea that we could hopefully, replicate the success that we'd seen in Iraq with the Sunni awakening. The Sunni awakening basically involved a series of negotiations with a handful of key tribal sheikhs that that led to widespread political change, and to basically embark upon a strategy of conducting key negotiations with certain tribal leaders in Afghanistan that would result in widespread political change through Afghanistan is virtually impossible because the society is so segmented. So if the awakening in Iraq was like equivalent of walking into a large banquet hall and turning on 6 or 7 light switches in these huge rooms, the awakening that would need to take place in Afghanistan would be the equivalent of walking into a tenement and turning on 250 light switches, because the negotiations, valley to valley, province to province, village to village, they're different. The power dynamics are different. I mean, they even speak different languages. You can be in Kunar province where everyone is speaking Pashto. You can literally get on the road, drive 2.5 hours to the north up into Nuristan, and people are speaking Nuristani, which is a very abstract language. And I remember at one point being with I was with Afghan troops that I advised, and we were in a pretty remote part of southeastern Afghanistan on a rat line where we knew it was so remote the Taliban were kind of running in and out of Pakistan from there. So we went to this village that by their records, the troops I was with, no one had been in for 7 or 8 years, at least. And as we pull up in our convoy, we're sitting there, and we all have the big beards, and it was me. I was with only about 2 or 3 other Americans, and so we weren't necessarily blending, but we certainly looked like all the other Afghans. And I look over my interpreter. I was like, what do they even think, you guys are? Kind of ask him. He's like, they must think you're really something out there. He's like, they think we're Russian. And he wasn't joking, So it's a very different type of war. The villagers who thinks that the Russians have shown up again versus someone who's living in Kabul. So, but I think it affects everybody.
You chose to. Your book is written from the perspective of a Pashtun boy. Mm-hmm. Why Pashtun? Since there's so many different.
Yeah, why not? No, and one of the things that comes up in the book a lot is this idea. It's called Pashtunwali, which, if you're not familiar with it, it directly translates into Pashtunwali as the way of the Pashtuns. And so, Pashtuns are one of the largest ethnic groups in Afghanistan. And Pashtunwali has these certain tenets of it. So one is called Badal, one is called Nang, one is called Mamastia. So Badal is basically vengeance. Nang is this idea of personal honor. Mamastia, sanctuary. For those of you who've seen Lone Survivor, for instance, when Marcus Luttrell is protected by this Afghan Pashtun in Kunar province. It wasn't because this Afghan loved America and wanted to help out Luttrell. It was because Luttrell had basically come to him looking for sanctuary, and as an honorable Pashtun, he was obligated to provide that sanctuary. And when the Taliban came looking for him as a Pashtun, he couldn't hand over Luttrell under this idea of Pashtunwali. So it's something they take very, very seriously there. In Afghanistan, they have a saying, which is, we've been Muslim for 700 years, but we've been Pashtun forever, which shows how deep the idea of being a Pashtu cuts, with the Afghans who are, even deeper than Islam in many cases. So, so when rendering that, I wanted to tell a story that anchored itself a little bit in Pashtunwali. So I chose a Pashtun boy.
Great music.
Yeah.
So Green on Blue, your title, can you give us some insight into what the motivation for those Green on Blue attacks are, as well as did you ever witness any?
Sure. I never witnessed a Green on Blue attack with any of the units I served in, although it was something we knew that was going on, and I was in units when we heard that 2 provinces over there'd been a Green on Blue attack, and the Afghans would hear about it, we would hear about it, and we would still have to do our job regardless. I will say that every advisor, some advisors would carry a small concealed pistol, in their hip, sort of right there, and some wouldn't. And the Afghans sort of always knew who did it and who didn't carry one, and it was a choice sort of everybody had to make, how they stood on that. And it was, it's not a big thing, but it was just sort of one of these small indicators. But for me, the reason when I wanted to tell this story, going into it, the motivation was very much I wanted to take something that, as I think Americans, we view immediately is morally reprehensible. How could somebody do this? This is corrupt. This is a deception. And the book deals with a lot of ideals of moral relativity. Like, yes, at face value, green on blue attack, it's pretty deceitful. But, and this goes to the, what are the motivations? It's like, but let's pull, I wanted to pull back the layers of this attack. Why does this happen? Like, why does somebody do one of these things? And if the book succeeds, by the time you're seeing, and I hope I don't, spoiler alert, there's a green on blue attack in this book. You might not agree with this attack taking place. You might, think it's wrong, and I would understand that. But the idea was to try to really deconstruct it so the reader would understand, though. So, like, listen, I can see the chain of events that leads to this green on blue attack. I might not agree with it, but I see the chain of events, and I think that's important because, again, I think it's sometimes very easy and reductive to sit back here and say those corrupt Afghans, how could they do this? But you look at the conditions under which many of them are living, and if you don't understand those conditions, if one doesn't understand those conditions, it's very, very difficult to understand how to end things like green on blue attacks, how to reduce the amount of corruption in the government there. And so, again, that was the sort of the ambition of the story, was to deconstruct one of those attacks.
We're going to try to end in a positive note.
Oh, good. I hope so.
So, what's the best possible outcome for Afghanistan? What are your hopes for Afghanistan? Mm-hmm. And of course, I've gotten a lot of questions about women in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. Is it getting better for them? What's the outlook for women in Afghanistan?
Sure. Well, I'll take the second part of that question first, seeing as we're trying to end on a positive note. I'm not, 2 weeks ago, there was this footage of a woman who was stoned to death in the streets in Afghanistan. That obviously does not bode well for the fact that women's rights are on the ascent in Afghanistan. At the same time, the First Lady of Afghanistan right now seems to be a very dynamic champion of women's rights. I think the issue of women's rights is very difficult in Afghanistan because when you get to the remoter parts of the country, it's an incredibly conservative society. It is. Those are the values that they have. Now, are those necessarily the values of the women in those places? Who's to say? But I think many of the women in those places have not been exposed to other values, so it's difficult to necessarily go into a remote village in Nuristan and start telling the women that they should be holding on to more liberal values. So I think it's a real challenge. I think that, but I do think in the future, in many of the cities, life could be more progressive for women as it once was. I don't have an easy answer to that question. I will say on the second part of that question, where do I hope Afghanistan goes? I think Afghanistan once had or it has a history of being a place that was culturally rich, economically rich. I hope that it could get there once again, and in fact, many of the people I know who still spend significant amounts of time in Afghanistan are pretty bullish on the prospects of Afghanistan. So that makes me happy. So I'm more concerned about Iraq than I am about Afghanistan. So, thank you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.